So I'm delighted to be back. I've been told I'm part of the furniture here. This is my third time back in Booksa, and it's great. It's good to see some familiar faces I haven't seen in 4 years. Yay! Woo! So it's nice, and I'm proud to be bringing back a book this time, finally. So if you like what you hear tonight, grab a copy. If you don't, grab one anyway for someone you don't like. And then call them a week later and say, hey, let's meet up and talk about the book I gave you last week, just to make them feel really uncomfortable. That tends to work wonders. You know, I do it all the time for people. The book came out. The book came out early February, and I've been waiting about 10 years to publish this book. I just wasn't ready at the time, so I was very, very excited to be finally flying back to Ireland to launch my book. I live in Vienna, so I was flying back to Ireland for the book launch, and I was super prepared. It was the Doolin Writers' Festival on the west coast of Ireland, gorgeous place, the cliffs of Moher just around the corner. There was 150 people attending that night in Hotel Doolin, and I got to the airport in Vienna. I got through the security, I had my breakfast, I was fierce organised, there early, booked a seat. I even booked a seat on the Aer Lingus flight. Got onto the plane, and it was cancelled. The pilot kicked us all off because of engine trouble. And I thought, Murphy's Law. So I didn't get to Doolin that night. So I sat at the airport in Vienna trying to get to London instead, and eventually got to Ireland a day late. But in that time I thought I'd write a quick poem called Aer Lingus Flight 661 from Vienna. It seems there are some who would prefer to be falling out of the sky in a giant ball of fire than waiting in line to speak to ground staff about later flights and reconnections. We are pacing the floor with headsets in our phones, on hold with help desks 1,000 miles away, eager to get to the front of the line to accost Watanabe with details about how important we all are. On the west coast of Ireland, it was announced passingly in Fitz's bar that Neil McCarthy's book launch had to be postponed. One man looked up from his pint and said, "Who?" So this is the book. It's called Stopgap Grace. It's published by Salmon Poetry, and I'm delighted to share a couple of poems with you tonight. Not too many, but a few. I'm not going to read the whole book, just in case you've never been to a poetry reading before and you've been bullied into this, don't worry. It's not like Mass. Wait. Speaking of Mass, I'm going to start with this first poem called The 11th Commandment. Lee and I were talking about the Catholic Church today, and we had various things to say about it. But I grew up in the southwest of Ireland, West Cork, not North Cork, not the People's Republic, not the West Cork. And down there, the mothers always have a kind of a phrase for everything. You know, if you were down in the dumps, the mothers would always say, "Get down off the cross, we need the wood." Which didn't do wonders for your confidence when you're a 13-year-old depressed teenager, you know, mourning the death of Kurt Cobain or whatever. I was recently living in Los Angeles with my wife, and there's a couple of poems in here about Los Angeles, a couple about Vienna, various places I've lived in the world. So the book is kind of like postcards from places I've been, all kind of looking at the Irish diaspora, what it's like to be an expat, an immigrant, and thinking about what is home. You know, what makes a traveller, an expat, an immigrant, an immigrant. So there's a bit of geography in this book, as well as a bit of maths. So this is called The 11th Commandment. I never thought I'd miss the sound of church bells, reminding me of my sudden apostasy, faintly ringing above the hubbub, where even the birds can't get a word in edgeways. And I think of Protestant churches back home, and the horse chestnut trees that guard them, their gravel paths far less worn than those of their Catholic brethren. And in my mind, it's always late October. So tonight, I walked through the big wind, the unexpected gusts that blasted with pleasure the streets where the palm trees had shed their garb. I battled north on Sunset, watched the fire truck barging its way through the lights on Coronado. I threw my head into a bar before happy hour ended, only to find the quiet man being projected onto the back wall, just in time to see Sean Thornton's lean in to kiss, and Mary Kate, pure as a storm, in the graveyard's alluring loneliness. Entranced by the projection, I watched the grainy landscape of my past silently flowing across the screen in Technicolor, disturbed now and again by the ripple of a passing shadow, a head-turning siren from the street, the fancy footwork of the wind sparring with the door. As Sean Thornton was laid out across the floor, and I wanted him to be me, an Irishman walloped by America, having broken every commandment bar one. Because here, though thou shalt not complain about the weather, the sound of traffic drums as consistently as rain carried in on a southwesterly, as we hold a finger to our lips to silence the misguidance of our gods. Cheers. So, you're welcome to heckle and ask questions as much as you like. But if you're too shy for that, it's fine. I'll ask my own questions. I lived in Hollywood. Is anyone American? Yeah, kind of.
Guilty.
Yeah, you all say you're Canadian these days. I know the feeling, yeah. I lived in Los Angeles, and it was quite an interesting place. People still ask me to this day, what did you do in Los Angeles for 4 years? And I said, I looked for parking, because that's what kind of city it is. I drove around 4 years trying to park my car. So I wrote this poem about that kind of theory, and it's called No Access to the Hollywood Sign. I lived on a street called Beechwood Drive, which is gorgeous because you can see the Hollywood sign at the top of the street. And yeah, I saw a lot of that street just looking for parking. This is called No Access to the Hollywood Sign. Everyone on Beechwood Drive has a dog. There is never parking. The dogs are always small and bark in the hours unknown to God. If there is parking, it's because there's street cleaning on the same side the next morning. One of these mornings, I'm going to get lucky and park on a small dog. I will slowly get out of my car, lock it, and in an air of nonchalance walk off. Owner of dead dog will be too engrossed in smartphone to notice. The sign that informs tourists that there is no access to the Hollywood sign is the most ignored sign in the whole of Los Angeles. The morning after the rain, I sit outside slicing strawberries into my Special K, watching the tourists pose for photographs in the middle of the road. You see, sacrifice and beauty go hand in hand, encouraging the jacarandas to defy the street cleaners and cast their purple confetti down upon the parked cars, the dead dogs, the tourists rebelling against the signs. I'm going to stay in Los Angeles for this one because I was quite fascinated when I was there about this whole... have you ever seen the TV show Portlandia? Not big down here, maybe you have, but parts of Los Angeles are quite similar to that. A lot of hipsters there. Who are really, really obsessed with food. I've never heard so many topics about goat's cheese, so many conversations about kale in my life. Do you know what kale is?
Yeah.
It's cabbage. That's all it is. It's a fancy schmancy name for cabbage. Get over it, it's cabbage. Did you? It's even a verb in LA. Did you kale today? Yeah, I kale. But I was fast, everyone was just talking about food. You get some chicken. Can you tell me where the chicken came from? Oh, it just came from a farm up the road. It's totally organic, it's bio, it's everything. Oh my God, I was so happy it was chicken. Yeah, it's a chicken. I found this fascinating. It was the same time, this poem was a bit dark actually, but it was the same time that Malaysian Airlines flight went missing. And I was frequenting all these cafes and bars around Hollywood. And all people were talking about was kale and goat's cheese. And well, on these giant TV screens in every bar and cafe, there was these muted images of, Malaysian Airlines flight taking off, and nobody was kind of asking the big question, which I thought was quite odd. So this is a poem called How to Kill a Pig. I expected them to tell me that my bacon had come from a happy pig, one that had had a full life, was corn-fed, had free range, did yoga in the mornings, spoke Latin, played the cello, learned to salsa dance while visiting relatives in Cuba. I half expected a photo album to accompany the sacrifice, documenting its first birthday, first snow, first day of school, first black belt, first of everything else, here an oink, there an oink. But in far corners, I dubbed the mouths of others, their new voices out-battling the clattering gunnery of plates, slamming down organic everythings. I gifted one woman berating her cell phone, the French language, to make her all the more endurable. I had the young couple sitting on the table next to me, nattering fondly from their deathbeds. Their soon-to-be-left world, better off now than it was when they were younger. The child in the high chair wanted in on the action, breaking into les enfants et les sortilages, when faced with a spoonload of non-GMO beige matter. I used a sortilege of my own in stripping the walls clean and emblazoning the newspaper headlines all over them, to see if anyone would notice, to see if anyone would put down their phone, to see if anyone would question that one glaring absence, as truth was led out the back, strung up by its hind legs and throat slit, left to hang there until the last drop of blood spattered into the bucket. I read that poem in Prague a couple of weeks ago, and hand came up straight away. Are you vegan? No. That's how you make sausages, kids. He left after that. He was vegan. So apologies to any vegans there, or dog owners from the previous poem. I didn't actually kill any small dogs, just in case you don't get the sarcasm. I live in Vienna, you have to explain these things sometimes. So speaking of bacon, this next poem has got a very catchy title. It's called Bacon. I thought long and hard about this one. But when I was in Los Angeles, I'm an English teacher in Vienna. When I was in LA, there's one word that really annoyed me. And it was awesome. Jesus Christ. Everything is awesome. And then the Lego movie came out. Everything is awesome. Oh my God, everything, awesome. Oh, there's no other adjectives except awesome. So I banned my students from using the word awesome. I have a friend in Budapest, his name is Dan Schwartz, and he's lived there for 20 odd years. And he bought a house in a national park up by the Slovakian border. And Dan is Jewish, and he doesn't eat bacon. And he bought a house in a village called Zaloma, which is Hungarian for bacon. Little did he know at the time. So I've been pulling the piss out of him ever since. So this poem is for Dan Schwartz. It's called Bacon. I ate tonight the best hot dog I have ever bitten into, wrapped in bacon, served in a toasted roll with caramelized onions and sweet chili, thick as an iron gutter pipe. I hated every bite, bitter in the knowledge it was costing me $8 plus tax. The fact it had been slid in my direction by an arm attached to a man in a baseball hat who shook his fist and told me that my choice was awesome. I like to taste effort in what I consider awesome. To suffer penance through hunger and weight, I blasted back to the langosh I ate after 3 hours straight on a passenger, the backseat of a car with no seatbelts, shuddering through Miskolc in the direction of Salona. You told me the latter translated as bacon, and I smirked at the irony, but bit my tongue and helped unpack while you took the gypsy proofing off the house, chopped the wood, aired the flumes, lit the fire, crushed the garlic, vacuumed the larvae from the windows, fixed the beds, fried the langosh, and opened the palinka. We ate that night the best bread I have ever bitten into, but not before bowing our heads in awe to the Spirit's holy gospel. Any questions? No. Ah, you're too polite. What? Anybody ever been to Vienna? Never? Yeah. Anyone from Vienna?
You're from Vienna.
You're from, oh shit. Okay. We might have to edit the video for this next one, right? You're from Vienna?
Not necessarily, but with it.
Okay, but you're not Viennese.
No.
Oh, that's fine. Sorry. That's good, yeah. Vienna's a cool place. I like it. I was just explaining to the lads down the back. It's a great place to get stuff done. Nobody actually bothers you. One of the reasons I moved there originally was that you can go to a cafe in Vienna and just sit down and have a coffee for 2-3 hours. The waiters will never come near your cup. So you can just read a book, write your essays, do your homework, tap into the Wi-Fi, that kind of stuff, you know. So I love the cafe scene there, and that's one of the first reasons I moved there many years ago. But I used to frequent this cafe in the 8th district called Cafe Hummel. And I've been going there every day. And always, you know, the waiters all have tuxedos, and they're a little bit unfriendly, but that's just part of it, part of the show. Every day for about 6-7 years I'd go in, and the waiter would come over and just say, "Yes, what would you like?" And I'd say, "Same thing I have every day. Rosa Browner," which is like a double espresso, bit of milk. No problem. Sometimes they'd even move me from my table because this was a table that belonged to an older customer, you know, in a fur coat and a little dog. So I had to actually get up and leave sometimes. That's the way the cafes are there, which is nice if you're in that scene. But I thought, what do I have to do to get into this scene, you know, to be recognized as a local? One day, not so long ago, a couple of months ago, I was in there and I was actually writing a review of a poetry book for my website. Fantastic American poet Mike McGriff, published with Copper Canyon. And I was tapping away on my little laptop, and the waiter came over. This guy who has never had a conversation with me in 6 years. And he just said, "What are you doing? Do you mind me asking?" And I said, "Yeah, well, I'm normally, my German is really bad." So I said, "Yeah, normally I teach English, but sometimes and I didn't know the word for review. So I just pointed at like the appraisals at the back of the book, thinking he'd get it from there, not realizing my finger was on the New York Times. Now, he thinks I work for the New York Times. I went in the next day and it was, "Grüß Gott, Herr McCarthy, große braune quick time. Your table is," he was kicking old women out of the tables. Brilliant. Yeah, I'm really milking that one at the moment. Sometimes I go in for a beer and I just get my double espresso, just still. This poem has another very catchy title. It's called Vienna. Quiet but for us, the Danube's dim mirror was disturbed in her sleep as we swam naked through the shadows of the firs tilting in the clean summer wind. In Heldenplatz, we hollered opera to the dome and heard the sound of hooves in the echo, that rapturous applause that time would later condemn to silence. We cut through Volksgarten to stop for a piss, shouting from behind trees about poetry which would need to be written. If you were Gustav Klimt, then I was Graham Greene in need of inspiration, and by Christ, I looked for inspiration. I looked all through the ornate parks in the first district, up and down the steps of the metro at Neuburgasse. I imagined naked the girl at the bar in Cafe Carina, her skin surrendering tattoos her parents would never have approved of. But she just lit a cigarette and dressed herself in limits. I looked at the old men on Brunnenmarket selecting eggs as if their fingers could see through the shells. I looked at David Reinhardt's fingers picking guitar strings with the same selective deftness. I helped you up a ladder onto a rooftop and watched as you stood there, proud as a lighthouse, inspecting the ferocity of morning blazing its westerly trail. There were 3 of us, and I got lost 5 years deep into Marie's eyes until you pulled me back out. Do you remember that morning, Stevie? Do you remember that morning with the Danube waking and stretching not too far from view? Because I remember thinking the seasons had been arriving later every year, as if the world has been slowed by the weight of graves. Or maybe she has simply become tired of turning or lying awake through a night of endless alarms that nobody bothers to turn off. We'll go from Vienna to Cork. It's inevitable. I'm going to
That's what we're here for.
Exactly, yeah, just the majority. I'm going to change my accent. No, for this one, it's not, you know what I mean? So if there's any tourists here from Waterford, Kilkenny, Croatia, the Cork accent, the city accent anyway, is a hard one, I think, for a lot of people. I find it beautiful and musical. Like, when a Cork person says, I would like to engage in a conversation with you, we just shorten it to, come here. That's all you gotta say. When a Cork person says, I have something relevant which I would like to add to this conversation, they just say, yeah, which means here, yeah. And it's a very efficient language, I love it. I was sitting in a bar one night over the far side of Parliament Bridge, and there's a fantastic bar there called Canavan's, which has the cheapest pint of Beamish in the city. So if you're ever in Cork City, wandering around and you find yourself on Parliament Bridge, go over it, on your left, cheap Beamish, sorted. Sorted means you'll be fine. And I was in there one night and there was a guy just kind of came up to me and sat down and started talking. I live in West Cork, which is an hour and a half south, so usually I had like an hour and a half to kill before the Galway bus, when the Galway bus arrived and the West Cork bus took off, so I went for a couple of pints of Beamish. This guy started talking to me one night, and he was very worried that I was suicidal because I was wearing flip-flops. You don't wear flip-flops in Canada's, apparently. And that's what this poem is about. And it's another very catchy title. It's called Parliament Bridge. Come here, away! At least you're fucking Irish, he said. Eyes Beamish black. A face that reminded me of Andy Townsend, an ex-professional soccer player who used to play for Aston Villa and Chelsea, for no other reason that Andy Townsend's face was the first face that came into my head as I tried my best to avoid eye contact. Yeah, city's full of foreigners now, he said, wiping 30 years of stout from his upper lip. They wouldn't be long, adding up at $2.85 a pint, and that for sure was not his first nor his last tonight. I wanted to tell him, though, that I was English, born in the Midlands, that my flesh and blood was as alien to Cork as Warsaw to Brooklyn. But oddly, he was more concerned with me throwing myself off of Parliament Bridge outside. Have you enough money? I had. And then he talked about wealth and the sacrament of land. And suddenly, I was unsure as to whether his face now reminded me of Andy Townsend, ex-professional soccer player, used to play for Chelsea, or Genghis Khan. "You're too depressed," he said. "You're too depressed, and you're wearing flip-flops." But sure wasn't the weather mighty altogether, as the full moon keeled over in the sky, laughing off any advance dawn might be planning. Still, plenty of time for me to throw myself off of Parliament Bridge, only to end up in a John Spillane song a few years from now, or a Billy Ramsell poem where the hero is not me, but he who hauls my bloated corpse from the waters on Union Quay. And if I died here tonight, then how bad? 'Cause you could bury me beneath these creaking old floorboards, where I could lie and listen to men like him craft cavalries from nights spent on park benches in London, from all the bricks that have bent his back, from the misfits of an Irish economy who would look at a man sideways for talking to me, as I stop to admire the flicker in the South Channel from the wall of Parliament Bridge. I'm going to stay in Cork for this one because it's the same accent. I don't have to put much effort into the hello. In the late 90s, I left school. Did my leaving certificate. It was around the same time The Shawshank Redemption came out. Have you seen that movie?
Yes.
Fantastic, yeah. And that summer, I got a job working in a quarry in West Cork. And I kind of drew a few parallels between The Shawshank Redemption and working in a quarry. Do you know what a quarry is? You take stone out of the ground. Basically, it's a real beautiful job. It's very fancy. This one has another very exciting title. It's called The Quarry. "Christ, we won't have a bob at all," Junior proclaimed, the last 3 words of his declaration rolling out as one. It had become every man's catchphrase on wet days, peering out from a rusting metal container unit at this disemboweled stomach of wet rock. Sinners did not pick stones in the rain, which is why we wouldn't have a bob at all. There were no posters of Rita Hayworth to adorn the walls of our asylum, and every coming Saturday night felt more like a chalky promise of parole. That summer took longer than most. 10 hours a day knelt in prayer with hammer and stone, feeling no remorse about using the Lord's name in vain every time the chisel slipped. Broken scabs on bloodied hands, as if 2 nails had been driven into each. Wouldn't himself be along shortly? Over the brow of the hill in his new Pajero, stone mad, blaspheming the Trinity to find out why we weren't on our knees. And by God, we wouldn't be long telling him where to go with his productivity. Out the gap, buzzing up those electric windows by. "Christ, you'd catch your death in that," Junior decreed, in an act of unparalleled ventriloquism, his mouth combating a swig of lilt and a fig roll. This was not a scene scripted by Stephen King, nor was it a movie narrated by Morgan Freeman, and it didn't matter a shite to Junior that he wasn't Andy Dufresne, quarrying himself to some eventual freedom. Do a couple of more poems and then we'll talk. There'll be a test at the end of this. Have you been paying attention? Doors are locked, right? Speaking of prisoners, this one is about Galway and playing Scrabble. Myself and my old housemate, we were very fancy schmancy when we were young, handsome bucks, single, a few bob in our pocket, no stress whatsoever. And we thought the best way to pick up girls was to go to the busiest pub in town and play Scrabble. Eventually there'd be somebody over your shoulder kind of going, 7 out of 1. Never worked. Nevertheless, we played Scrabble every Friday night in Galway. This is called Q on a triple letter square. When you texted to say you were in the bog because the shouty man was setting up in knockers, I realised we might just have had as many codes as POWs planning a tunnel. Weather permitting, we'd be sitting outside on Cross Street, smiling in wonder at whether the non-attentive sipper had noticed the pigeons shit in their Guinness, or if the smell of turf's wet cement had registered on anyone but us. Perhaps we would be somewhat sensitive at times like this to that 5-year down the line thought, stacked deep as kegs in the mind's cold room. And we worded those streets like a Scrabble board, finding the Lexus as we went, sometimes stuttering, sometimes free-flowing and cavalier, strolling past the pier in its quiver of swans, with talk of future queens, of lands to conquer, articulate as landing a Q on a triple letter square. Perhaps it's easy to look back now and be sentimental, you from your throne, me from mine, a small sideways smirk escaping as subtly as that one prisoner nobody thought would make a run for it. Thanks. I'm going to finish with one poem. I go to poetry readings a lot, and do you know what I hate about poetry readings? This is a confession, we can edit this out of the video. I hate going to poetry readings and the featured poet says, and I'm going to finish now with these 6. Okay, this is like Mass, you know what I mean? And I'll read them first in translation and then in the original. So you kind of look at your friends, you know, if you did go to Mass as a good Catholic, you got your Holy Communion, then you went outside and that was it. Maybe you didn't even get communion, you just left when people got up. That's what I tended to do when poets said, I'm going to... I was gone. So the book, anyway, is here. It's in my hand. It's free. I'm very proud of it. I think having your first poetry book is kind of like having your first kid. You're just dying to get rid of it. So it's available tonight for purchase or theft. And yeah, like I said, there's a theme running through it. This is Icarus, who crash landed after taking off from the labyrinth of Ireland in Vienna, in Los Angeles, in Moscow, in Melbourne. And yeah, like I said, there's a theme about running away here. And so the final poem is called This Isn't Silver Lake Anymore. In another life, I'd run away with the waitress, scream across Santa Monica Boulevard, negligent of red lights. In another time, I'd perhaps get her to take the wheel while I shoot out the tires of the pursuing cop cars, confident of making the Mexican border before nightfall, before somebody builds a wall. And we'd lie low in Tijuana, cut and dye each other's hair, and think about the maps and the madness of our options. Bolivia might come into the equation, as may Honduras, which would be less of a drive and warmer at night. It might then be time to dump the stolen Cadillac. Back in Los Angeles, the newspaper headlines would make my colleagues giddy with perversion. In a smoky room One of those old-fashioned style telephones would ring, the receiver lift, and a crackling voice announce in excitement on the other end, "McCarthy made it!" Desires, though, crackle like moths to a hot bulb in this cafe. The scripts abandoned and the headshots growing older by the day. They still dress the part, mind you. My waitress in her bowler hat and black bra visible through her thin white cotton blouse. My neighbour in his stripy three-piece suit, Salvador Dali moustache and a pocket watch to boot. But I was told about the ice cream parlour across the road, so I divert my attention, watching the clientele come and go. And all of a sudden, I realise it's not me that's on the run. It's you. And there you are, dressed to the nines, dark sunglasses and bouncy hair, men waiting until you've passed before turning to inhale the slipstream of your perfume. Picture, it's Florence, it's summer, there you are. Outside a cathedral, pigeons scatter as carabinieri race towards a bank alarm calling out for help. But you just light a cigarette, toss the matchstick over your shoulder. It's all being filmed in black and white, don't you know, to give it that timeless sense. Well, from an open balcony window, we can hear a cello play the Bach preludes as you disappear into the foreground and the credits begin to roll. Now I'm listening to the slightly scratched voice of Joan Baez singing about junipers in the pale moonlight. Applause erupting like hailstone upon a corrugated iron roof. And I'm singing back through the bedroom wall, wishing the neighbours would just shut up for once and listen. But night has arrived with its baton, taking its dark lectern on cue and conducting its flotilla of noise. Police helicopters, fire trucks, ambulances, a car alarm crying wolf to the night, headlights, red lights, green lights, gas station forecourt lights. Sunset Boulevard, from this angle, looks more like a fallen Christmas tree. And I'm home again, reading emails, casting my mind back to those nights we would spend in Galway in wine bars as poets, arguing over new ways to describe the same thing, like colours. Misty memory green, winter cheek red. Each new phrase coined, celebrated, like a scientific breakthrough. In another life, I'd run away with you into the tattoo blue of early evening. We'd cover our tracks and burn every single one of those maps. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming.